welcome to it. This is Free Media, Free Minds, the show that shows and doesn't just tell. And tonight, I'll be showing you around all the issues that threaten media freedom, not just in South Africa, but in Southern Africa. And tonight, we'll have a look at everything around state surveillance. Have you ever felt like you were being watched? Well, chances are you are. So joining us in studio today to help unpack this discussion is Karabo from Amabi and Khalib from R2K. Welcome.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Do you guys just want to give us a young breakdown, a young bio of what you do and where you come from and the work that your organizations do?
Sure. So my name is Karabo, and I'm with the Amambungani Center for Investigative Journalism. And so we do investigative journalism. So we've done exposés like on the Gupta leaks and other big exposés of corruption in society. But as part of our work, we also advocate for a free media. And so one of the big legal cases that we've taken on, which we're going to be discussing today, is on the surveillance of journalists and how to stop that using the law.
Fantastic.
I'm Khalib. I'm Khalib with the Right to Know campaign. We started out about 10 years ago to put a stop to the secrecy bill, and we're very successful in that. And a lot of the work that we do also is about accessing information and protecting personal information. So the question around surveillance and the increased securitization of the state is really important to us. So the surveillance of journalists in particular and activists is really important, and which is partly why we joined the action led by Amabi on the RICO case. We'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yes, we will. We will get into it. But I think let's just get down to the basics. What is surveillance? Because, I think it takes on many faces, and it isn't just a matter of CCTV. So, Karabo, can you give us your opinion on what is surveillance?
What is surveillance? Yeah. Well, that's a very broad topic, so I'm going to narrow it down to what we're concerned about. So surveillance, which is the one that we're concerned about, is state surveillance. And this is essentially when the state, using various technology and also tools or monitoring, takes a look at what its citizens and individuals of interest are doing. Now, the intention of surveillance, if you look at it from its purest intention, is to allow the state to protect its citizens from, from crime or other types of threats to them. But we're seeing globally, as well as in South Africa, that the state is using surveillance not for its intended purposes of crime fighting, but essentially to monitor citizens to potentially infringe on fundamental rights and freedoms.
Fantastic, exactly that. I think it's an issue more of going from surveilling people for the sake of their safety and then moving into surveilling people for the sake of wanting to know what they're up to. Okay, so we are joined in a little bit by, or rather joining us in a video will be Jane Duncan from UJ, just giving us a brief understanding of what surveillance is. Check this out.
When we talk about surveillance, we talk about the routine monitoring of people's activities, mainly for the purposes of social control. So people who are involved in politically sensitive activities, like journalists, political activists, trade unionists, even lawyers, I think should be concerned about the possibility of surveillance. And there are so many different ways of undertaking surveillance these days. In the past, surveillance would involve often the infiltration of organizations or the following people on foot or by car, in a car, in order to generate what we would call human intelligence. Whereas these days, with the application of the internet to many of our communication practices, there are just so many additional ways in which surveillance can be undertaken. So, for instance, our cell phone can be tracked even if we're not speaking on our cell phone, because our cell phone generates what's known as metadata, or data about our communications and about our location. Also, our internet browsing habits, for instance, can be stored, and it's this kind of information that can be used in order to build up a very rich picture of who we are, who we interact with, what our political interests are, where we travel, and who we speak with on an ongoing basis. So because of the huge potential to be able to compromise us, particularly if we are involved in politically sensitive areas of work, we need to know a lot more about when we generate data, how and when it's stored, who gets access to it, and how it gets transmitted to different public and private entities, because it's become increasingly important for us to be able to maintain control over our data and practice data sovereignty.
Fantastic. So that was Jane Duncan just giving us some insight on what exactly surveillance looks like and what surveillance is. So Khayelitsha, can you maybe tell us, are people really being watched without their knowledge, and how? How is it even possible for that to be the case?
So people are being watched. Whether it's with or without their knowledge is another question. And I think both of those are happening. So the most common iteration of surveillance is the CCTV cameras. Certainly in a city like Cape Town, we have CCTV cameras populating various neighborhoods, and that have been effectively used by the city of Cape Town for many years. In Johannesburg, for example, they're rolling out CCTV cameras across the metropole, and using a private service provider to use both the backbone, the fiber backbone, in order to capture the video, but then also to get a faster response time. Those CCTV cameras are essentially there from a crime-fighting perspective, and gives the city, in this case, eyes on. But we are seeing in Cape Town and in some of the other cities the use of drones, not only from a crime perspective or to fight poachers along the west coast, but also to see when fires are happening, like on the mountain, for example, right? But if you're caught in the traffic in the morning, the traffic police have license recognition technology in the cameras that they put. You know, the speeding cameras also have license recognition technology. And so things are getting more and more sophisticated, I guess. And so, yeah, there are cameras everywhere. Having said that, it's not just the state's response, but when you go into buildings, you'll see CCTV cameras, surveillance cameras in your local corner shop. You'll see, in fact, the TV with like 5 different or 6 different camera shots, So there is a lot of footage being taken of people, ordinary people going around their day-to-day work.
So you're saying that it's not just government, but also the private sector that
Absolutely.
we've seen use surveillance.
Yeah, I mean, people put up CCTV cameras even just to protect their own house, right? And sometimes there's some issues around that, like which way is the camera facing? Does it breach the privacy of someone else? So those are some of the questions that, in fact, the deployment of CCTV cameras, whether by the state or by private institutions or ordinary citizens, does raise. Is to what extent does that infringe my right to privacy, particularly when I'm not in a public space?
Yeah, so when it comes to the private sector, and let's talk a little bit about that. When it comes to private sector surveillance, is it just a matter of CCTV cameras, or what other, because I mean, we did mention that government does use many phases of surveillance. So when it comes to private sector, I'm sure it's not just CCTVs as well.
So the question around surveillance obviously is recording with a purpose, right? And so if the purpose really is to see who's coming into a building, then the most logical method would be the CCTV cameras, most widely deployed. However, surveillance also is about intercepting telephone calls, for example. So if I'm at work using the PABX system, right, those calls could be recorded. That also is one of the avenues of surveillance, right? And if we then go into the digital world, There's quite a big hullabaloo. Both Amabi and R2K raised this around how mobile service providers are being forced to record the data of people on their networks and keep that data for up to 5 years, so that that's available to security, the police, or whomever. So, so there are all of these different ways in which both private sector and the state do record our movements. In your intro, you talked about Google throwing up adverts when I'm doing a Google search. But what's even more worrying for me is that Google will ask me, once I've visited Century City, how was your visit to?
Yeah.
Right? Google
Yeah.
Maps will tell me that. And I'm going like, how do you know that?
All right, Khalid, we'll get into this in a second. We're going to have a little bit of a look at the protests that have recently been happening in Hong Kong around the surveillance and how upset citizens are about this. Let's have a look. So now that we've had a sneak peek into what's happening in Hong Kong, why are they so upset? What is the issue? Can you, Karabo, maybe tell us?
About the Hong Kong protests. Look, I'm not an expert on the Hong Kong protests, but I think what's happening in Hong Kong is something that we're seeing globally as well, where citizens are saying that we want to make sure that the laws which involve us are not going to be laws which will be used against us. And so the initial protests in Hong Kong were about a particular law which would allow the Chinese government to extradite individuals living in Hong Kong back to China. And the protest was saying, but this is going to potentially harm us. And so to demonstrate their outrage with this particular arrangement and to make sure that the government was hearing them, they went out onto the streets. And this is a democratic right in South Africa and globally to say when you're unhappy about what your government is doing, you should be able to go out and make your voice heard and make your voice heard in numbers. What's extraordinary about Hong Kong is just the sheer volume of protests coming out. And I think that's important because it shows that this matters to many who are living there. But it's also, I think, important in terms of this, what we're talking about today on surveillance, because the way that we are getting information is obviously through social media, but also because of journalists who are covering what's happening in Hong Kong. And the reason why surveillance becomes a problem for journalists and also for a problem for our right to know what's happening in the world around us is because journalists, in order to cover what's really happening, need to be able to talk to sources. So, for example, journalists would need to be able to talk to protesters to find from them what's happening. But for protesters to feel comfortable and safe about talking to journalists, they need to know that they're going to be, their communications are going to be kept confidential, because they might be worried that if they are seen to be talking to a journalist, they might face some kind of repression. And so when the state is able to monitor the telephone calls or the meetings or the interactions between journalists and protesters or other members of society, that becomes a problem for journalism and for the truth to actually be put out into the public domain.
So Khalid, why are these protesters so upset?
So as we saw in the clip that we've just seen, protesters who've been talking about this extradition law that the Chinese want to impose or activate, we're taking action against the CCTV cameras that have built-in facial recognition capacity. And this has allowed the mainland Chinese government to target specific journalists, but also activists. And in fact, last weekend we saw an activist who was involved in the previous set of uprisings, the Yellow Umbrella protest from several months ago, being arrested. So he'd been identified. And people were taken to the streets also just to try and stop the rollout of something like 400 of these facial recognition cameras across a city And so that really is something that is also happening internationally. Whether it's happened here in South Africa is a question. We're maybe not yet there, but that is happening in some of our BRICS partners, China being one of them, should give us some concern.
Yeah.
Maybe also to say that one of the other things that the Chinese government has been doing in the Hong Kong protests has been to really spin its own story. And so both Twitter and Facebook have actually blocked state-owned media houses from reporting anti-protester kind of narratives, because that's the propaganda. So the flip side of that surveillance is actually what the state does with that surveillance. And so it's also about capturing the narrative, if you like. And so if you're talking about free media, free minds, etc., you're not getting the full picture. And that's one of the things, one of the dangers of when state security apparatus goes rogue, if you like.
So on the other hand, we've seen in Khayelitsha the rollout of more than 40 CCTV cameras. So the KDF, which is the Khayelitsha Development Forum, the spokesperson said that out of 45 units, 6 will be installed in all entrances into Khayelitsha, and will be able to pick up vehicle registration as well, like you mentioned. And one will be a thermal camera to detect fires and will assist with shack fires. And the rest will be installed on main roads, producing up to 800 meters of quality pictures. So considering this, surely surveillance does have a place in society.
Well, look, I'm not going to take a view on whether or not these systems should be set up in Khayelitsha, but one of the things that we should be concerned about is how our data is captured and stored and used. And so it's one thing, for example, for this number plate recognition to be used for crime fighting or to see people's movement, but one of the things that's a problem when it comes to surveillance tools is that there isn't transparency around what happens to that data. So is it only the police who have access to it, or is it the police and private companies and possibly the government who have also got access to this and might use it not for its intended purposes? And so when it comes, and I think just to like kind of roll back again, it's not, when we talk about the need for, or when we talk about surveillance, it must be understood in the context of our right to privacy. And now in South Africa, we've got the right to privacy. It's a constitutional right. It's not something which right to know Amabunga and others want. It's something which is a right like anything else in society. And so the problem with many of these types of surveillance tools is that, one, it's not transparent about how the data which is captured is then used, who it's given to. Are there other third parties who are getting access to this? The other problem with it, and this comes up in our legal challenge to South Africa's surveillance law, is something called having the right types of safeguards. And so if you're going to have these technologies which are very invasive, so suddenly you aren't free to move where you want to move without being watched, are there safeguards to make sure that it's not being abused? And so the things that we need to be worried about when these types of systems are set up is, how is the data going to be used? Is it going to be given to parties who shouldn't have access to it? And what kind of safeguards are in place? Without these types of protections, this type of technology can be used to harm us rather than to protect us.
Yeah. All right. So something in common between South Africa and Kenya, or Johannesburg and Nairobi at the moment, is the installation of CCTVs in taxis. In the case of Kenya, in taxis, to manage crime. So with that being said, I mean, you mentioned laws. Are the laws that are in place that allow governments and private sector to surveil us, are they free? I mean, are they fair? Are they warranted?
So, I guess I was taught that when you ask a difficult question, always to say it depends. Right? And I guess it does depend. One of the things about South Africa is that certainly we have good laws by and large. And even though RICO is a terribly drafted law, it's a framework, it's a legal framework. But what we have seen is that in the implementation of surveillance activities, that either the law has been bypassed, or it's been flouted, or ignored. And so it's clearly not strong enough in terms of a regulatory, the regulatory role that the law plays. I think that generally speaking, that if you're in a public area, right? Whoever you are, you can be recorded. So that's just from a general privacy perspective. If you're in public, then I guess the contract that you've made is that you can be recorded. There is a big question around what happens with that footage, what happens with that information. Who has control over that is a really important question. And so with the Khayelitsha scenario, who will be running the cameras? Will those feeds be going to the KDF or to the City of Cape Town? And if it's going to a private entity, then we have some very important questions around the control and the use of that information.
Precisely that. It's about where the footage goes after it has been taken. We'll get into this a little bit more after the break. If you have just joined us, you are watching Free Media, Free Minds, and we are discussing the growth of state surveillance. So before we took the break, we did mention the RICO legislation. And to speak to us here in studio is Karabo and Khalib. Can you just tell us why have your organizations been fighting over the RICO legislation?
Yeah, well, look, a lot of us know about RICO because when you have to get our SIM card, we are told that you have to go and RICO your SIM card.
And we kind of just forget about it after that.
Yeah, so it's just this thing that you're supposed to do when you want to be able to use your cell phone and get the SIM card inserted. And our RICO actually refers to a piece of legislation which is the state's lawful ability to watch us, to monitor us. What we are saying is that when RICO was signed into law, it was signed with the intention of being used for crime fighting, of extreme crime. So the state needed to be able to listen in on phone calls, potentially be able to access your emails, to be able to see if you're involved in some kind of unlawful activity and then take the necessary steps to stop that or prevent crime. That was the intended purposes, but one of the fundamental flaws with RICO as a surveillance law is that it doesn't have enough, it doesn't meet constitutional standards for what a piece of surveillance legislation should look like. Now this is important because surveillance is so invasive in terms of what it does to us as citizens, but then in particular for journalists who've got a duty to make sure that their conversations with sources are kept confidential. So Amabongani took on this case when we discovered that one of our reporters, Sam Soul, had been under surveillance. So his telephone calls between himself and a source during the time when he was investigating the decision by the National Prosecuting Authority to drop charges against former President Jacob Zuma. So now Sam was talking to a source as part of the investigative process. We only found out one of the problems, let me just say this, one of the problems with RICO is that even if you are under some kind of surveillance, you will never know. It's completely secretive, so you could be sitting here with me today, we could have a telephone call after this, you could be under surveillance, but you'll never know because it's, there's no evidence which you can pick up as somebody who's being monitored. We only discovered that Sam was under surveillance when, incidentally, years later, during the Democratic Alliance's application to have the charges reinstated against Jacob Zuma, his lawyer submitted an affidavit, and annexed to that affidavit was a transcript of his conversations between himself and his source. And that was the first time that we had actual evidence that one of our reporters had been under state surveillance. Now, when Sam was talking to a source, this was not a criminal activity. It's completely legal for a journalist to talk to a source. And so that brought up important questions about why was the state interested in his conversations? And the only deduction which we could draw from that is because it was state surveillance capacity was being used for political purposes, not for crime fighting purposes. So we're saying in this application to have RICO reviewed that RICO allows for these kinds of abuses of South Africa's surveillance capacity. And in order for these types of abuses to stop, we need to make sure that there are necessary safeguards. And so a person who's under surveillance should be notified after the surveillance has happened that they have been monitored, so that they can say, but why have I been monitored, that you can potentially challenge that. But there's also another important side, and I think that this has not been raised enough, is the state is saying we can monitor your telephone calls, but the state has also now got the capacity to monitor almost anybody in society through bulk surveillance. Now this means that the state on an ongoing basis is able to access your internet signals, and so the emails that you're sending, everything that you're doing online, And this is happening completely outside of any type of legal framework. So this means that all of us potentially are under state surveillance on an ongoing basis. So all our private communications are being monitored by the state in an indiscriminate way. Now, this is outrageous because the purpose, again, of surveillance is to be targeted. And so when the state discovers that maybe you're involved or maybe I'm involved in some kind of criminal activity, they can ask for a warrant to be able to listen in on communications. Bulk surveillance makes us all essentially criminals within a society.
Exactly. So when it comes to the protection of journalists then, or rather the protection of sources for journalists, does surveillance then not put our sources at some kind of risk then?
Absolutely, and I think this is the biggest thing. So we need to be able to have journalists who are free to do their work in order for us to get information. So a source will want to be able to say, I'm afraid to publicly speak to a journalist because this could potentially harm the source in a particular way. We know in South Africa that there have been cases of whistleblowers who have been killed for their courage of coming out to speak about what's happening, what the wrongdoing that's happening in society. So the way that journalists protect their sources and get a story out into the public is by saying to their sources, I can protect you in this relationship and take on the risk rather than that source to take on the risk and potentially face some kind of harm or even be killed. So when the state has got the ability to listen in on those conversations or monitor through CCTV cameras, if a source is going to meet up with, a journalist is going to meet up with a source at a local, coffee shop or something, then CCTV cameras also become a problem because then obviously the state or the city can see that they're meeting up with certain people at particular times. And so we should be concerned when journalists are under surveillance because it means that our right to know is being harmed because journalists can't go about doing their jobs. But another thing that we raise in our application is that there's other professions where that type of what we call a duty of confidence, and so a duty of confidentiality is important. So when a client is talking to a lawyer, that type of conversation needs to be confidential. And so we say where there's a profession where confidentiality is required in order for that person to do their job, the state should not necessarily not be allowed to use a surveillance tool, but so we call it the threshold. So the justification that the state must use must be much higher when a particular person who's a journalist or somebody else who has to keep communications confidential is the target of surveillance.
Would it be possible, do you think, to have a more, what would I call it, a more structured fashion of surveillance? So for example, there's been a recent invention of ShotSpotter, which is a surveillance system that only activates at the sound wave or the sound vibration of shotguns because for the purpose of fighting crime alone. Would it not then be more effective to have a more controlled type of surveillance then?
So maybe part of the court case was precisely that, was to try and beef up the regulatory framework, because we found that security agencies were ignoring the requirement, for example, for a warrant. Right? So if I've targeted someone, I'm afraid that a crime might be committed. So then I go to the RICO judge and ask for a warrant to tap the phone or access whatever communication. That was ignored in probably 90% of the time. And we saw rather famously before the Polokwane conference, remember the corruption charges against former President Jacob Zuma, couldn't go ahead. Bulelani Ngcuka was the NPA boss at the time, and he said, we have evidence, but we don't have a winnable case because some of the evidence had been illegally obtained. So the phone taps hadn't been properly authorized, for example. So that evidence couldn't be used, but could be used for a political purpose. And so the problem is that that isn't restricted only to political parties. Actually, all of us are at risk in relation to that. The ShotSpotter is an interesting thing. It's deployed here in Cape Town and in Port Elizabeth, I think, is the other place where it is. And in two areas, in Manenberg and in Hanover Park. And it picks up it can tell you what caliber weapon was utilized, whether it's fully automatic or a pistol or whatever.
Sure.
So it gives you a lot of that kind of information and has been fairly effective in identifying where those hotspots are and then to allow for the police to go in. It hasn't stopped the gang activity, right? But it's one of those that that does allow for more targeted responses. The question, though, is the listening in capacity. Is it tuned only to what else can you hear? Is a question that many privacy activists have been asking. Is it only the shots, or can you listen into other things? Does it provide? And our government has been less forthcoming about that.
And I mean, that's a really important point, because sure, I mean, the ShotSpotter is the first time I'm hearing about it, but sure, it might be using it in very specific circumstances, but one, that's not the only question about surveillance. It's about, one, is it properly regulated? And what we're seeing with a lot of surveillance technology is that the lawful framework is falling behind the progression of technology. So there's sort of a gap between the tools being used versus it being a lawful practice. But secondly, it's also about transparency. And so when a technology is used, we need to know how it's being used, where the information is going. So we as people in society, as journalists, as others, need to know what's actually being used, or what's being used against us, what's being used for us. It can't simply be the state or a private entity saying, this is for your good. It's about saying, but tell us exactly how it's going to be employed. Tell us where the information is going to be shared. Tell us if I've been a target of surveillance, and if I have been, I should be able to ask questions about why I specifically was targeted. So I think that the big question here is about regulation and transparency. We need to be able to know so that we don't have our rights and freedoms trampled on by these new types of technologies.
So would you say that there's a loophole in the Privacy Act, Protection of Private Information Act? Would you say there's a loophole in that, or do you think that it's everything else around that, the regulation of the regulations that you mentioned? Is it the loopholes in the act, or is it just people don't care and they're just going to go forth with it anyway?
I think the regulatory framework consists of multiple pieces of legislation. Okay, so the issue around the right to privacy is something that is protected on multiple fronts. So surveillance is being regulated, for example, by RICO, and we're finding that that's not a strong enough regulation, right? We've got the National Communications Center outside of Pretoria that's been operating at least for 10 years outside of the law. And what it's done is it's plugged into the cable where all of your email correspondence, for example, is going in and out of the country. And it talks about what foreign originating signals. So it will monitor any communication that originates outside of the country. But that includes every single Gmail email, for example. Right? So even if I'm sitting in Cape Town, the Gmail service outside of the country, that's getting read and being monitored and intercepted. So, and that's been done outside of the law. So that's the kind of thing that really we need to bring back into the legal framework. The other challenge, though, is that communities seek security. And so the KDF initiative, for example, is happening for the first time in Khayelitsha, but multiple other neighborhoods have rolled out CCTV cameras, for example, in their SIDS. And so that's also for communities seeking security. But that clashes then with the right to privacy for them as well. And so it's a delicate line that we have to track.
All right, we are speaking everything that you'll need to know around the growth of state surveillance. We'll take a quick ad break, and when we come back, we'll continue the conversation. Welcome back to it. You are still watching Free Media, Free Minds, and we're about to enter our final segment, and we are going to look into protection of data, or just protecting our own personal data. So we're going to talk a bit about data protection. So recently, Facebook users got very excited for a app that would make their faces, make them look a little bit older, right? But unknowingly, they had at the same time been submitting their personal information to a Russian company. So with that being said, is there a relationship between social media, data protection and surveillance?
No, I mean, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Look, I think one of the things that came up, there's something called the Cambridge Analytica data breach, and this was essentially about the interference of an election campaign. And the point to make here is that often we find these fun games online which allow us to, test 10 things which will tell you what your future is going to look like, or this, make yourself look older thing. And they're fun games. But again, if we don't know who's behind or who's taking our information when we put our photo online or fill out these fun quizzes, then we don't know how that information is going to be used and if it could actually be used against us. So in this huge Cambridge Analytica data breach, people were busy using these Facebook quizzes, and that information was then used to manipulate how people ultimately voted. And so then the information is used against you, because then those who are trying to target you will figure out, oh, you like this, you've got a preference for this, these are your friends on social media. So using that information to manipulate your reality, to make you make decisions in a particular way, and important decisions about, important political decisions, decisions about who to vote for and what kind of services you're going to get. So I think the world online is a good one, but I think you always need to be asking questions about who's behind it and what's going to happen to the information that I'm so freely sharing. And I think that's the biggest thing to say. As citizens, as journalists, as we need to be thinking about how we're sharing our information. And then we also need to be asking the tough questions. There's also good resources which are out there if we want to inform ourselves. There's a great group of people they call the EFF, but not the political party. It's the, now I'm forgetting the name. Electronic Freedom Frontiers, and they've got lots of guides and resources about what to do if you think that you're under surveillance, or the kinds of questions you can ask if you're worried about a particular app that you're using. So I think it's good to get ourselves educated and informed. Right to Know's got a lot of resources as well. I'm sure Khalif can talk to that. On our MRB website, if there are sources who want to talk to our reporters, we have information about the best ways to talk to our reporters. So I think we're going to have to take responsibility in terms of educating ourselves to build resilience against any types of surveillance. But at the same time, I think it's important for ourselves, Right to Know, and others to be challenging the laws and the state to say, yes, we'll take the necessary steps to protect ourselves, but also the state and the private sector should be not abusing us using either lawful or unlawful means.
So maybe just to follow up on that, we could, one of the other pieces in the RICO judgment was, or RICO case, was around the use of metadata. And so all of the things that Karab has been talking about now was the manipulation of the metadata. It's not actually the communication, but really it's where you're located. It's what Google Maps uses to track you, for example, right? It's the recording of which calls you, who you called. And then, and over time, with more and more of that information, you can create a very good profile of the person. Now, Google, Facebook, and other platforms use that then to push, this special deal. You'd be interested in this. Why not, right? So they want to monetize that. So the send you adverts, but it can also be used to push you into making some other choices, because that's really what that's about. It's about making choices, whether those are economic choices or shopping choices, or potentially election choices. That's what we saw in the US election. It was there in the Kenya election recently, and we also see how social media platforms are being utilized to target people, and so these Cambridge Analytica type organizations use that metadata to create profiles. And so that manipulation is something that should worry all of us. We need to be careful online It's an identity. It's part of us. It's a virtual identity, but the same kind of level of security that we would feel in the physical world, right? We also need to exercise that kind of awareness when we're in the virtual world. And so trust is a really important aspect of this. Who are you entrusting your data to? What are they using that information for? Just to say about Facebook, for example, they've got a running research project called Social Science 1. And they're giving their 1 billion users information to various research organizations to troll through and create, utilize all of that metadata for whatever purpose they want, and to create algorithms that would target these people. So there's a huge pool of information internationally. We know that several million Facebook users in South Africa also got caught in those exercises. So we're giving our information, we're trusting these private companies with our information, but we don't really know what that information is being utilized for. And so we need to become a little bit more aware and security conscious also in the virtual world.
Okay, so as we begin to conclude, would we then say that surveillance is a form of power?
I mean, information is power, and
Yeah.
surveillance is a form of controlling the flow of information. And so where the state has got more power over the control of information, it means that as people in society, that power is being taken away from us, and that's not a correct balance within society. But I think as we're closing, I think one of the tools that we've got in South Africa is, in addition to the constitutional right to privacy, is that we've got an institution which has been set up to protect us against our privacy rights being violated, and it's something called the Office of the Information Regulator. And it's an office which was set up to protect our privacy. So as citizens, we should be, I think, demanding a lot more of this particular office, because it's sometimes been described as being our protector when it comes to our data rights, our privacy rights. And so there's an institution which is there that should be working for us and on behalf of us to defend us against both state as well as private sector surveillance.
Yeah.
Right, fantastic. And then our last question, just before we finish up, is it fair that our phones are really functioning at our own detriment? Do I now have to take my camera out of my phone and disconnect my recording devices? Like how, I mean, besides pasting a sticker onto my laptop's camera, just 3 points as to what we can do in our day-to-day just so that we are better protected from being hacked, if you will.
Well, it depends on what you're doing, I guess. No, it depends on what you're doing. Do you have something to hide, is the question.
Yeah.
So just physically taking care of the camera, for example, both your smartphone and your laptop would be a very practical thing. The problem is that smartphones you're using the location service to use your GPS, for example, right? So that's something that you need for that. But it can also be used to track your movements, right? So it really becoming much more clear about when you are sharing that kind of information. So turn that off, for instance. Go off smartphones, because smartphones actually are way too smart.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of information that's being kept even on your phone for a long time. So I guess do a digital detox. Maybe think through what digital devices you do need and where you access certain information is maybe also important. If you are surfing, there are lots of VPNs, so creating a virtual, a safe space in which your web footprint can't be tracked, but it does mean creating an additional firewall to block that, for instance.
And then I also know that there's probably people watching this show who will say, but I've got nothing to hide. My life is an open book. I don't do any kind of,
Sneaky
covert,
things, yeah.
sneaky type of work. But surveillance and privacy rights is not about something to hide. It's about thinking a different way about what you need to protect. And so if you need to protect your loved ones, if you need to protect your children who are going to school, if you need to protect the people that you talk to because they're involved in work that might be compromised by state surveillance. It's about thinking that way. So I don't think anybody should walk away from this thinking, I've got nothing to hide, therefore this doesn't affect me. We've all got something to protect, and so privacy and surveillance should matter to all of us.
Fantastic. All right, we're going to take a quick ad break, and when we return, we'll get into our community notice board.
There's a recipe for things like this. When you love too hard, dress too loose, speak the truth, and act from your core with no excuses, this is what you get. And this is how it happens. Step 1, just ignore the statistics. Don't pay attention to the language between the lines. You will never be that 1 in 5. These types of things will not hit home for you. Step 2, hand out your trust to everyone you lay eyes on, especially those who bed their eyes on you. Step 3, do not listen to your gut instinct when it tells you to be careful. It's impossible for one to love recklessly and keep a guard up at the same time. Your heart has always been too large for your chest. Clearly, its capacity must be captured by others. Step 4, remember, monsters only exist in fairy tales, not in the crevices of your college campus. Step 5, do what you're told. Smile and be polite. Anything else will lead you to destruction. Step 6, get comfortable. Life will repeatedly remind you that this is ordinary, this is normal, this is okay. Step 7, when your best friend introduces you to the man sent out to destroy you, shake his hand and give him all of your attention. Don't focus on the fact that he's been watching you. Don't ask where he came from. Assume he's good company. Step 8, don't question anything. This is not a conspiracy. This is just you having fun with your friends. You're having fun, right? Do not overthink anything. Keep having fun. Step 9, when he tells you you're pretty, say thank you. When he touches your breast on accident, apologize for being in his way. When he asks to go up to your room, tell him no, and make sure you have a good enough reason. Step 10, there's never a good enough reason. He is going to get what he wants from you, even if he has to take it. Step 11, realize much later he had a plan the entire time.
Can you tell me which of these images best resembles the shape of his face? Okay.
He's got short hair, bald, round eyes, quite far apart, brown, normal looking wide nose, thick lips, and sharp stubble from his mustache. Thick, bushy eyebrows, and wrinkles around the corners of his eyes. They show when he gets angry. He's always hated that.
This is unfortunately all the time that we have this evening, but thank you to our guests Karabo and Khalib for joining us in this conversation. We will continue the conversation on Facebook and on Instagram. You can follow us at freemedia.freeminds, we do follow back, or on Facebook at Free Media Free Minds. My name is Chelsea Ogilvie and I'll check you next week. Good night.